These days, it's hard for one not to sense the soullessness of the modern world. We're told that, well, since the Enlightenment era, we've left an age of darkness in which people used to be superstitious and silly, unlike modern people today, and that we're more rational. But is that really true? Because if we're looking at things, would you rather live in this crazy liberal world we've inherited or the past? Because to me, people still seem insane. Are we really enlightened by comparison to the people of the past? Look at this multimillionaire who's trying to live forever using science, throwing away his son's inheritance. We've lost touch with something higher. You can see it in our architecture, in our art. We seem dead and uninvested in the future. Clearly, we've lost a sort of energy and vitality that we once used to have. Liberals, I want nothing to do with them. So I want to do the complete opposite of what they do. Take inspiration from a time period and culture they seem to loathe more than any other time. And that seems to be the medieval era, the Middle Ages. And of course, one of the things that it's associated with is being called a dark period. It's the Dark Ages. But what was so dark about it? Wouldn't we say that right now is a dark period? I think this era is turning out to be far darker and soulless than any other. How can this be an era of light, as we're more rootless and morally confused than ever? And so I'm fascinated by this group of people, a group of people who was making something so inspired, architecture that looks like that took forever to make, sometimes never seeing these constructions fully built in their own lifetime. Really, could it have been that dark? What inspired these people? What did they believe? What was their mythology? What were the narratives that were around during their time period? Obviously, we know Christianity was just beginning and important, but what stories did they live by? What do you usually think of in terms of history or mythology or legend? Obviously, it's of the chivalric knights and the Knights Templar. You think about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and more so than anything that sticks out to me, at the very least, is this Holy Grail. Everything during that time period seems to be centered around that mythos. Was it a real item? And why did we abandon this mythology? What led to this culture's decline? Why did people care about this concept, or why were they on a search to find this physical object? What exactly does that mean? Why would somebody take a quest, go on a journey to find this item? Someone I've decided to use as a guide is Julius Evola. In his book titled The Mystery of the Grail, Initiation and Magic in the Quest for the Spirit, he covers a variety of different interpretations of the Grail in its meaning, in why somebody would pursue it, laying out a bunch of interpretations of what the Grail and the quest for it could have been. So, taking into consideration what the culture of the era was like, chivalry evokes imagery of women having doors open for them, knights saving the princess, stuff like that. In medieval culture, it seems that they really developed an understanding of love. And love not as it pertains to lust, but something higher and greater. And so instead of lusting after a woman, you would instead look for a woman that was inspiring and would focus masculine energy on higher things, on ambitions and goals that were more divine, if you will. So a lot was expected of women, that if they were going to be treated in a chivalric manner, that they are very, very upstanding. So regarding the quest, one of Evola's main interpretations about it is that of the feminine being associated to the Holy Grail. Usually what you'll see is a woman in paintings who's holding the Grail. And furthermore, he also talks about how the Grail represents the unity of the masculine and the feminine. I wonder what this could all mean. He also mentions an ancient myth, one of an island of nymphs, and that it was on this island that soldiers that were heroes, successful in battle, would go mingle with the nymphs so that they could obtain eternal life. In chivalric or medieval culture, your progeny, your bloodline were important. During the start of the medieval era, things were still pretty chaotic, with lots of war. It was a brutal time when life looked bleak, as men were still Viking around, until all of that masculine energy was refocused by the church, using poetry to encourage men and women to love one another, and focus on the concept of marriage in particular. And it was this custom refined that put children at the center of it. Children used to be considered the future, and it seems that the concept of love and the mythology around the Grail might have emphasized that importance of the family and the child that was created through love, as it focused the attention away from oneself to others, to the future, and as a result, higher aims. And it seems like during this time period, they were really getting that right. So is it any wonder they were building these beautiful structures? The investment into the future was worth it to them because they knew there was more to life than just their individual existence. They, of course, would feel lust, and instead of denying it, they would learn to focus their urges towards a divine goal, understanding that merely using someone in a purely material sense always led to issues. They learned to master the senses, not deny them, that one must conquer the snake or the dragon, so to speak. The Garden of Eden mythos is precisely about the symbol of the snake and how it relates to lust. And this too is commonly associated to the Holy Grail in a myriad of ways. If you study the Holy Grail mythology, you'll see this weird sort of back and forth between the symbology of snake and the symbology of the fish. And interestingly, how it sometimes even morphs into the symbol of the dragon. And this is fascinating if you have an understanding of ancient history and mythos. What you'll come to see is that there are specific groups of people who seem to have this marker of either snake or fish, which they associated to themselves. And they oftentimes were the leaders of great civilizations. And of these great ancient civilizations or groups of people connected to similar symbology, Evola mentions a very mysterious group of people known as the Tuatha De Danann, who migrated to Ireland, and that they in particular seem to maybe even be the most connected to the myth of the Grail. So this mysterious people is mythologized as having migrated to Ireland, but from where? Which makes me wonder, what exactly are the roots of this mythos of the Holy Grail? where does it come from? As it seems it was ancient even to the people of the Middle Ages. And what about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table? What are the roots of those tales? Aren't they English? Because while these stories are all taking place in Europe, there's this weird tie to Christianity too. We know that when we think about Knights of the Round Table or King Arthur, that's something that's very, very European. And that it's also something that's associated to nobility, to kings and queens, to dynasties. So this all makes me wonder if this myth of the Holy Grail is rooted in the lore of one group of people in particular, maybe a particular bloodline? Why have bloodlines and nobility become a thing of the past? Well, as we're taught in school, this system of noble people ruling over others was something that happened on our way to enlightenment and reason. All of this reason led to a series of bloody revolutions to democracy. And the secular world we live in today, right? These revolutions don't seem very reasonable. And considering our trajectory since this so-called Age of Reason, we've clearly lost a sense of a higher purpose. In my mind, things seem to be getting darker, not brighter. Liberals always seem to say that it wasn't until the Enlightenment that people could see reality for what it was, and up until that point they were completely lost. Finding the Grail, while it could have been a physical item, it clearly had spiritual implications. And it was the chivalric knights, of course, who had an initiation process of sorts for becoming a knight and had esoteric knowledge of how to find it. But what's fascinating in relation to the topic of the development of liberalism in the West, Evola talks about how the quest for the Grail ends up sort of changing over time, that it loses relevancy right before the Renaissance. And during this time period, the quest of the Grail seems to change or pretty much disappear. This would have been during the Ghibelline era of the Middle Ages, just before the Renaissance kicks off. He explains that the initiation process changed for the worst as this era came to a close and the new one began. But what's fascinating is that one of the elements of this initiation process is to become enlightened. And that the concept of enlightenment changed. The Renaissance, like the Enlightenment, is a secular era, and the focus moves from the church and God to the individual. And interestingly, this is what Evola says happens with regards to the idea of enlightenment. That enlightenment used to mean that we would need to look beyond ourselves to achieve it, but that during the end of the Ghibelline era, that focus turns towards ourselves. We no longer look to God for enlightenment, but now humanity instead for that inspiration, meaning it becomes a secularized concept, which it wasn't originally. Towards the end of the Gothic period is when the Templars are burned at the stake. It's not just pagans that are burned at the stake, it's also the Templars, which is odd. One of the reasons mentioned is that it has something to do with their rituals, as it seems they may have been trying to revitalize something or maintain their original initiations, some element that the church didn't agree with. In any case, Evola says that in the failure of the Knights Templar, in what they're attempting to do, whatever that might be, that this to him signals the end of the West, and that this is when traditionalism truly fades, and our connection to our roots are severed. This Tuavola is when liberalism really kicks off, and when the old system is replaced with the new one, with secularism and democracy. Chivalry ends, dynasties fade away, and so too does the quest for the Holy Grail. So, in the ushering in of this new age, with the Gothic era behind everyone, and this new form of enlightenment, it makes one wonder, what are we really being pushed towards now? In the absence of that old mission, are we now in pursuit of a poisoned chalice? Looking at the state of our world, how could one think otherwise? That instead of using love as our guide in being fruitful and multiplying and building a world for those who will come after us, who share our roots, in our radical individuality, we are now worshiping ourselves, it seems. And instead of seeing the sacredness in the world around us, we're choosing to debase it, to abuse our senses, and instead of being full of life and vitality as we once were, we are now controlled by all of our devices instead of being the master of them, which are pulling us uncontrollably into unconsciousness. That collectively we're headed not towards life, but death. We are now truly lost and soulless in the process of becoming enlightened, with all of the people flooding into our borders, and this reshaping of how we're supposed to look at ourselves. It's only further severed us from our roots. So-called reason has been used, weaponized as a means to convince us to erase our past. Erase our past and convince us that we should be open to the world, that there is no particular group of people that are the center point for what it is to be European, that we're all out of Africa, after all, right? All of this has served globalization. As people of European descent, this has really just all been a means of attempting to disinherit us from the gifts of our ancestors, to convince us that our bloodlines are unimportant and not worth preserving. Speaking of blood, that is quite possibly one of the most common things that's associated to the Holy Grail, that and wine. As the story pertains to the crucifixion of Christ, it is said that Joseph of Arimathea uses a grail to grab Christ's blood that drips from his side during his death. And as the legend goes, he ends up taking the grail with him. And apparently, where the physical grail went, according to the legend, was to Britain. Evola makes a mention of this in his book on the Grail as well. Well, that seems kind of crazy, right? That has to be just a myth. Is there any validity to this? What about Arthurian legends in general? All of this is just fairy tales, right? Looking at the Wikipedia, it mentions many times that King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table were not real. It's very adamant that this is the case. Well, going back to Arimathea, he too is a part of that lore, if you will. So if King Arthur isn't real, then surely the story of Arimathea is also just a thing of myth. Or is it? Interestingly, there is an abbey called the Glastonbury Abbey, which has that legend or myth associated to it. That when the locals talk about that old structure, which is extremely old and is said to be built by Joseph of Arimathea, and that he went there after the death of Jesus and had a ministry there and ended up taking part in building this abbey. Well, in investigating this site, I found something very mysterious, and it's what's inside of the crumbling, partially destroyed abbey. And it's this grave site. And this grave, apparently, which has now been mysteriously removed, only has a plaque that says what was once buried there. And what it says is that King Arthur and his wife Guinevere were buried at that location, but that their bodies were moved elsewhere. That's so incredibly bizarre. Wait, so does that mean that they and this mythology are real? Thanks for watching, guys. If you're still interested in this topic and want to know specifically more about Evola's book, I actually did a video for Arctos that's on their website. To get access to the video, you'll have to subscribe. So go over there and check out the other part of the video on their site, or check out their Substack to gain access. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time.